Donald Trump became the first U.S. president, sitting U.S. president, to ever visit North Korea. Now, Bill Clinton has gone there, but he wasn't in office when he went there. And this was Donald Trump, as the president of the United States, visited North Korea. He walked across the demilitarized zone and he met with Kim Jong-un. In addition to that, there were the negotiations that happened in Singapore, and things were very, very hopeful. And it was clear that for all of the problems of the Trump administration in terms of their foreign policy, as awful as they were to Cuba, as awful as they were to Venezuela, as awful as they were to Iran, it seemed like one thing that the Trump administration was committed to doing was moving ahead with peace on the Korean Peninsula. And that was really, really hopeful. And that was historic. And if you ever want any evidence of deep state, whenever, it's funny, there's certain people, a lot of people, they just have this like brainwash in their minds where if you say deep state, they go, oh, that's not real. That's a conspiracy theory. There's no deep state. There's no covert actions by intelligence agencies. There's no CIA. There's no MK Ultra. There's no Congress for Cultural Freedom. It's all just made up. These are crazy conspiracy theories. Well, I mean, it's not. A lot of these things are a matter of public record, but I will actually pull up, this was an event that you should be aware of. It was happening as Donald Trump was moving ahead. There's a Wikipedia page and everything. As Donald Trump was moving ahead with peace, moving toward peace on the Korean Peninsula, there's a Wikipedia page. Read about on the 22nd of February, 2019, the embassy of North Korea in Madrid was attacked. At the very time that Donald Trump is trying to make peace with North Korea, the very time that we're seeing historic events taking place, at that very time, there was an assault on an embassy, the Madrid embassy of North Korea. North Korea has diplomatic relations with Spain. They had a relationship with the Franco government there. And at the very time that was happening, their embassy, which is, that's a country, that's an act of war. There was basically an act of war committed against the government of North Korea, against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And what happened? Well, this is what the Wikipedia page says. The North Korean embassy in Madrid incident is an event that occurred on the 22nd of February, 2019, at the North Korean embassy in Madrid, Spain. The political group Free Joseon, which opposed the incumbent Kim Jong-un government in North Korea, is alleged to have attacked and raided the embassy, while the group maintains they were invited in. Yeah, that's right. A group of individuals stole mobile phones, 2 alleged pen drives, and a hard drive, and handed them to the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The events took place after the Singapore summit between North Korea and the United States, and in the approach to the Hanoi summit. The suspected perpetrators are citizens of Mexico, the U.S., and South Korea, who later denied any connection, although the latter two governments denied any connection with the incident. Right? The Spanish privately briefed the media that they suspected but could not prove that the Central Intelligence Agency involvement because the attack was professional in its precision. One former CIA agent, however, said the timing of the attacks and its high-profile nature made it impossible for the CIA to have condoned or taken part in it. So right as Donald Trump was moving ahead with peace on the Korean Peninsula, a group of people attacked the North Korean embassy in Madrid, stole computer parts and all of that, and then delivered them to the FBI. Now, why did the FBI not arrest them? It is a crime to attack a foreign embassy. These people, there were arrest warrants for them. So why did they then go to the FBI and hand over North Korea's information? And why did Spanish media, get briefed that this was a CIA operation? this happened. There was clearly some forces that wanted to undermine and prevent the negotiations. You'll also remember that while Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, was supportive of the process, John Bolton was not. And John Bolton, in the lead up to the negotiations, said that like Libyan options were on the table. And he said, similar things to Libya, where, the USA ended up murdering Gaddafi and such, that kind of thing might be on the table. So it was very clear that while one section of the U.S. government apparatus was interested in moving ahead with peace on the Korean Peninsula, another section of the American government was trying to undermine the efforts. You had the attack on the embassy. You had John Bolton making those comments about Gaddafi and Libya and trying to basically threaten, the North Koreans. And remember what happened is Libya as a country was getting better. Its relationship with the United States was getting better. It was, it was being taken off the list of foreign terror, state sponsors of terrorism. They returned the Lockerbie, the person who'd been arrested for the Lockerbie bombings. Gaddafi was calling Obama his little African son. Things were getting better, and that just enabled the United States to slip their forces in and pull off a color revolution. It was awful, right? And so in the lead up to North Korea trying to improve its relationship with the United States, you have John Bolton coming out and saying, Libyan options are on the table. Libyan options, that was, a signal to North Korea. Yeah, we still want to destroy you. We're just trying to trick you. We're trying to undermine what Donald Trump was doing. Now, there were two individuals who were huge supporters of Donald Trump's efforts to build peace on the Korean Peninsula. First one was Congresswoman at the time. She was a Hawaii Congresswoman, Tulsi Gabbard. And she talked about how, that fake message had gone out, letting people know that there was going to be a nuclear strike and everyone had panicked. And she said that you need to negotiate and that she was a huge supporter of Donald Trump's efforts to negotiate peace on the Korean Peninsula. Also, another big supporter was Jim Rogers, the legendary Wall Street investor who now lives in Singapore. Jim Rogers, he wears a cowboy hat. He's a Wall Street investor. And he came on Fox News and he pointed out that most North Koreans are fluent in more than one language. Did you know this? Most people in North Korea can speak more than one language. That ain't true in the United States. It pisses me off. I tell people I'm a product of our amazing, great U.S. educational system. I can only speak one language, English. But if you go to other Western countries, in Britain, France, Spain, Sweden, Norway, it's just common sense because it's much easier for children to learn languages that in their schools, they teach you learn a second language. You learn Spanish, you learn French, it's just common sense around the world. But our education system in the United States is so bad that, I took like 2 years of high school Spanish. I took a year of high school French, but, trust me, I only speak one language. It's infuriating. It's infuriating to me that our education system is so bad. But in North Korea, a country that's been surrounded and barricaded, they've been under military threat for decades and decades and decades, most North Koreans can speak more than one language. In addition to that, Jim Rogers pointed out that, part of the reason that North Korea has had food issues is because the arable land, the land that you grow food on, is all in South Korea. North Korea is the mountainous regions. Those mountains in North Korea are full of minerals. And there's a lot of minerals that didn't have any value 30 years ago, that were just worthless rocks 30 years ago, but now are very valuable in computer chips. There's regions in Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and other parts of Africa, the Central African Republic, where there are minerals that were completely worthless that are now extremely valuable because they're used in computer chips. And North Korea has got those minerals. Those mountains in North Korea, they don't just have coal in them. They got a lot of coal in North Korea, a lot of coal in those mountains, but they don't just have coal. They have got very valuable minerals that could be used not just in computers and computer chips, but also in electric car batteries. North Korea has a lot to offer, economically. And furthermore, North Korea, they're under threat, but they realize they need to have a Deng Xiaoping moment. They need to have a reform and opening up. Kim Jong-un openly wants to bring in foreign investment into North Korea. He wants to have partnerships. He wants foreign companies to come there and open joint ventures with the North Korean state-run industries. Wouldn't it be great if, American car companies and North Korean state-run car companies could have a joint venture and they could start making better cars in North Korea? Wouldn't it be great if Chinese companies, that make cell phones, they could do business in North Korea and not then get hit by U.S. sanctions? Because this blockade on North Korea, you have no idea how bad it is. You have no idea. And I'll get to that in a second. Here, got another super chat. All right. But in these sanctions, people think the sanctions are just, oh, well, North Korea, they can't do business with American companies. No, it's if your company does business with North Korea, you can't do business with an American company. Right? These sanctions are horrendous. Any company that does business with North Korea is unable to do business with the United States. That's what the sanctions are. If you have if you have a cell phone company, if you make computer parts and you want to start exporting them to the United States, at U.S. Customs, you're going to have to sign a form confirming that there is not 1 ounce of North Korean or Cuban or Iranian minerals or computer parts or anything in, that you basically, you do business with North Korea, the USA boycotts you. That's how these sanctions work. And they've done this to Iran. They've done this to Venezuela. They've done it to Cuba. I mean, these are criminal sanctions that they have imposed on North Korea. And they barricaded the country. And they have held out. I mean, it is amazing. North Korea, you talk about a country that has been just devastated. They were devastated in the Korean War. Every building above 1 story tall in North Korea was bombed. Can you imagine that? Every building above 1 story being destroyed. They bombed the dikes and flooded North Korea. About 4 million people, between 3 and 4 million people were killed in North Korea during the Korean War. And after that, they went back to work and they industrialized their country and they built a modern education system and they wiped out illiteracy and they built a modern steel industry and they became kind of the Las Vegas of the Soviet bloc. Pyongyang became a place that people liked to go on vacation. People from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, it was like they talked about how it was like the Las Vegas of the communist world. And then after the Soviet Union fell, the USA hit them even harder, because they couldn't get oil. They couldn't get gasoline to run their tractors with. And they had a food system and they'd worked really, really hard. Even though they're in a mountainous region, they worked really, really hard to build a modern food system in the country, to become food self-sufficient. They talked about how they had fields on the sides of mountains, but they needed gasoline for their tractors. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, because of the petrodollar and because Comecon, the communist, global economy, the communist trade networks were ripped apart, they could not import any oil. They couldn't get US dollars to buy petroleum. And so because of that, their food system was crippled and they had a food crisis. And in addition to the millions who died during the Korean War back in the 50s, you got a food crisis in the 90s. They called it the Arduous March, where people were starving to death because the USA wouldn't enable North Korea to get their food system running again. And North Koreans were starving to death. And there was a food crisis created by the United States in the country. It was horrendous. And under those circumstances, when the population was starving, North Korea said, they're going to invade us. I mean, we're under attack, because the North Korean government, any other government, would have collapsed in the face of a food crisis. In African countries, if they have a food crisis like this, the government falls, the country descends into civil war. Not in North Korea. They managed to hold the country together amid this, but they said the USA is going to attack us. They're going to attack us. And so in the context of this food crisis, North Korea said, you know what, we're gonna get nuclear weapons. And the whole world said, oh shit, North Korea is going to get nuclear weapons. And so Bill Clinton made a deal with North Korea. And he said to North Korea, okay, you don't get nuclear weapons. We will build peaceful nuclear energy power plants for you. We will send you heating gas for the winter so you can keep your population warm. We will send you food. And Bill Clinton made this deal with the North Koreans in the 90s. And for a little while, North Korea, they were going along with it. They accepted the deal. Meanwhile, the United States was giving them some food, helping them build peaceful nuclear power plants, giving them heating gas. But then the U.S. Congress, the neoconservatives, the Republicans in the U.S. Congress didn't fund the deal. They cut off the funding for the deal to give North Korea, what they had been promised. And North Korea, they're like, hey, we made a deal with you that we wouldn't get nuclear weapons in exchange for you giving us food for our people, for you giving us heating gas, helping us build peaceful power plants that'll be monitored by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And you didn't give it to us. And that's what happened. And then 9/11 happened in the United States. And 9/11 had nothing to do with North Korea, right? I mean, it was, Saudis, Osama bin Laden, and nothing to do with North Korea. It's on the, it was in the United States that it happened, and it was Saudis from the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia, who did it. Had nothing to do with North Korea. But after the 9/11 attacks, George W. Bush, remember George W. Bush, that piece of shit president? He was an evil motherfucker, but that's a whole nother story. But George W. Bush, this rich kid from Connecticut, whose father was a president and a CIA director, he reinvented, I don't know, some of you kids may not remember, but back in the day, we had this, he reinvented himself to be a Texas cowboy, right? He's a rich kid from Connecticut. He was in the Order of Skulls and Bones, this weird secret society fraternity at Yale. His dad was a CIA director who became an oil man, an oil company tycoon who eventually became president. And George W. Bush, he reinvented his image, and mainstream media helped him with it. CNN and Fox and MSNBC, they all helped George W. Bush reinvent himself to be even though he's a rich kid from Connecticut who went to Yale, they reinvented George W. Bush to be a cowboy. He was down on his ranch. He had a ranch and a cowboy hat, and he was out there. And so after 9/11, George W. Bush, he gave a speech and he said, there's an axis of evil in the world, an axis of evil, the terrorists. And you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And there's an axis of evil. And the axis of evil includes Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. 3 countries that had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. It was totally ridiculous, right? You have Iraq, Ba'athist Arab socialism. They've been fighting Al-Qaeda from the beginning. The Muslim Brotherhood hates them. The Wahhabi Saudis hate them. It's Ba'athist Arab socialism, Soviet-aligned country, secular government. They had nothing to do with Osama bin Laden and the Saudis. Then on top of that, you had Iran, a Shia Muslim country, the Islamic Republic of Iran, considered by the Saudis to be Shia apostates. They consider them to be false Muslims, right? Have nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. Nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. They are Shia Muslims. Al-Qaeda are Wahhabi Saudis. Had nothing to do with them, right? The Islamic Republic of Iran, a revolution against the United States, a Shia Muslim religious government, unlike the Saudis that are Wahhabi monarchs who came to power because of the United States. The British Empire basically divided it up, Sykes-Picot Agreement. Completely has nothing to do with 9/11. And then North Korea, which is led by the Korean Workers' Party, a Marxist-Leninist party with their own interpretation of the Juche ideology, which is a specific interpretation of communism and Marxism applied to the Korean Peninsula, the teachings of Kim Il-sung, the founder of these 3 countries had nothing to do with 9/11. But after 9/11, George W. Bush was out there. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. The terrorists. The terrorists. You're with us or you're with the terrorists. You're with us or against us. And then there's an axis of evil. North Korea and Iran and Iraq. They're the axis of evil. The evildoers. It was awful. So North Korea is you didn't give us all the things you promised us for peaceful nuclear energy. You didn't give us the food we wanted. And now you're calling us the axis of evil. And then without the approval of the United Nations, with France and Germany and Italy and most of the NATO countries not even approving, the United States unilaterally invaded Iraq, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and destroyed the country. And at that point, North Korea is like, fuck it, we're getting nuclear weapons. And they did. And they withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They got nuclear weapons at that point. Now, does that make sense? I think it does. I mean, given the circumstances, everything that led up to North Korea proliferating nuclear weapons, I think it makes perfect sense why they would do that. Now, I obviously believe in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I know that if you get rid of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that would open the floodgates, okay? And Russia and China did not approve of North Korea getting nuclear weapons, because if the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty goes away, that opens the floodgates. Then all of a sudden, any country in the world can get nuclear weapons. Any country that has nuclear weapons can give nuclear weapons to any other country. So because of that, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is important. So Russia and China had to disapprove of North Korea, and they had to go along with UN sanctions on North Korea because of the fact that that opens the floodgates, right? The USA helped South Africa get nuclear weapons. The USA has helped different countries get nuclear weapons. And because of that, there was a feeling, when they signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there was a feeling that, okay, in order to stop every country in the world from getting nukes and every nuclear armed country giving nukes to all its allies, we have to have this treaty. And that makes sense. However, from North Korea's perspective, they were on the brink of basically, being invaded in the middle of the food crisis. They threatened to get nukes. They made a deal not to get nukes. The USA reneged on the deal. And then the USA put them on a list of 3 countries that they wanted to overthrow. And then, without even the permission of the UN, with the disapproval of all the NATO allies, the USA then shock and awe. You remember shock and awe, where they just blew up Iraq and killed hundreds of thousands of people. They just blew this country to shreds. They, with the whole world saying, you can't do this, right? At that point, North Korea got nuclear weapons. It makes sense why they would get nuclear weapons. And it makes sense why they wouldn't just give them up now, right? After what happened in Libya, after the death of Gaddafi, right? All right. Very good question. After the death of Gaddafi, the North Koreans published a very, very insightful, logical article. And they said, look, the USA said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, but now we know that was a bullshit lie. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And they got invaded and overthrown, and regime changed. And now the country's a mess, and people are dead, and there's refugees, and terrorist groups have set up shop, and the ethnic religious groups are fighting each other, and it's a disaster. Meanwhile, Libya had a nuclear weapons program, had weapons of mass destruction, but they gave them up. After 9/11, they began cooperating with the United States in the war on terror, and they gave up their nuclear weapons program, and they gave up their weapons of mass destruction. And look what happened. Libya became the subject, was subject to a U.S. destabilization, color revolution, and ultimately a NATO bombing campaign that destroyed the country. So North Korea, after the death of Gaddafi, they published an article and they said, look, we were clearly right to get nukes. Well, why wouldn't they say that? Makes sense why they would say that, right? Under such circumstances, it makes sense. They said, look, Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction, and look what you did to him. Gaddafi had them, and he got rid of them, and look what you did to him. And we've got them, and we're still here, and we're safe, so we're keeping them. But at the end of the day, it's not good for the world to have nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. It's not good for the world. Right? Not good for the world. Wrote it down. Thanks for the super chats. I'm writing them down. We'll get to them in the second half of the show. It's not good for the world for North Korea to be under threat, to be surrounded and under attack, right? Okay. And it's not good for the world to have the Korean Peninsula divided. It's not good for the world for the USA to have thousands and thousands of troops in South Korea. It's not good for, the residents of South Korea, to have a huge military base in the middle of their capital, Seoul, the capital of South Korea. It's got a U.S. military base the size of Central Park right in the middle of it, right? I mean, that's humiliating. And the fact that the Korean people, one nation, one language, one history, have been divided, that's awful. And let me add that while obviously the USA is the most vicious to North Korea, killed 4 million of their people during the Korean War, starved many of them to death during the 1990s, the USA hasn't been very good to South Korea either, right? I mean, South Korea, after the Second World War, the northern half of the Korean Peninsula was liberated by Soviet troops. The southern half was still under Japanese dominion. And then when Japan surrendered, the USA moved in. And they first put in a military dictator named Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee was the military dictator of South Korea. What was supposed to happen was there was supposed to be an election for the entire peninsula where they would elect a new government. But the United States said to the Republic of Korea, the government in the South, that if the communists are allowed to participate in the elections, you will get no aid, you will get no support. And so in the South, they forbid the communists from participating in the elections. And the communists were not allowed to be part of the elections. And then on Jeju Island, where there were, a lot of communists and labor activists and progressive people, they, were protesting. They said, we want a real election where the Communist Party, one of the biggest parties on the Korean Peninsula, where they're allowed to participate. And they had peaceful protests demanding the right of communists to participate in the elections. And in response to that, there was a brutal massacre. Read about the massacre at Jeju Island. It's horrendous what was done. Thousands of men and women and children were just slaughtered. It was horrendous. And Syngman Rhee became the military dictator in South Korea. And then after the Korean War, you had the April Revolution, the famous April Revolution, where it was college students who revolted against Syngman Rhee. The college students, they went out into the streets and they got shot down by the military and they got run over by tanks and they protested. And eventually the dictator, Syngman Rhee, was forced to step down. An amazing moment where the young people of South Korea came out against this military dictator and they organized and they gave their lives and sacrificed and they forced Syngman Rhee to step down. So then the United States is thinking, oh shit, what are we going to do, right? Because the communists, even though the communists are totally illegal in South Korea, you cannot have a communist party. The national security law says if they've put people in prison in the last decade or so, they put people in prison in South Korea just for retweeting like North Korean news items or retweeting Kim Jong-il or whatever. I mean, it's like, that's how insane it is. But even though the communists were illegal, they had been a big part of this democratic uprising against the dictator, Syngman Rhee. So then they found a new leader of the military, Park Chung-hee. And Park Chung-hee came in. But the United States realized that if they didn't start raising living standards and improving conditions in South Korea, there was going to be a communist revolution, that the people of the South were going to rise up. So the Kennedy administration worked with Japan and forced Japan to lend a huge amount of money to Park Chung-hee, the new military dictator. And in the 1960s and 70s, Park Chung-hee used the government. It was a Bonapartist military regime used the state. It wasn't the free market that did it. It was the government. He used the state to build up industries. And they built POSCO, a state-run steel manufacturing company. They built telecommunications companies, Samsung. You look at all of that. And it was the government, a military Bonapartist regime in South Korea that enabled living standards in South Korea to go up. That's an important point to make, right? People say, oh, look, South Korea is prosperous because they have the free market. In North Korea, they're all starving because of communism. Wrong. South Korea, it's not a socialist country, but it is not a free market country by any means. There's a huge amount of government control over industry, government control over various aspects of the economy. I mean, state monopolies like POSCO and Samsung. I mean, it's like to call South Korea a free market economy is utterly ridiculous. They've gotten more free market since the 90s, but at the time that their living standards were rapidly increasing under the Park Chung-hee government in the 60s and 70s, it was not a free market economy. And because the United States didn't want there to be a communist revolution in South Korea, because they didn't want communism to expand to South Korea, the United States had to allow South Korea to industrialize. And Park Chung-hee, he was a brutal, Bonapartist, and he had like concentration camps for homeless children. Homeless children, they would round them up and work them to death in camps. And that was exposed in the 90s. It was horrendous. He would disappear. If you were a socialist or a communist activist, a college student or a labor organizer, you'd be disappeared in the middle of the night and never heard from again. They might find your body on the street. Park Chung-hee was a brutal, brutal military dictator. But he was able to raise living standards because the United States needed to stabilize South Korea against North Korea. But in the 1970s, U.S. policy started changing. And this is what's very interesting. U.S. policy started changing during the 1970s, right? 1973, Pinochet took power in Chile. And Pinochet became the military dictator of Chile, but he wasn't like Park Chung-hee. Right? Pinochet took power in Chile, and unlike the various military strongmen the USA backed all over the world, oh boy, thank you, Phil. Unlike the various military strongmen that the USA backed all over the world, Pinochet didn't use the military to industrialize the country, right? That's what the Shah of Iran did. That's what Park Chung-hee was doing. That's what various dictators in Argentina and Venezuela would do, is they would use the military control over the economy to try and stabilize the economy. But Pinochet came in there and he brought in Milton Friedman and the Chicago schools, and they just destroyed the Chilean economy. They just privatized everything. And they wrecked the economy of Chile. And for 4 or 5 years, you can read about it in The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. For 4 or 5 years, they just ripped the Chilean economy to shreds. And there was mass starvation on the streets. Children were passing out in school from a lack of food. They got rid of the school milk programs. The kids didn't have milk in school. And the price of food like doubled because they got rid of all the food subsidies. And they just, Chile under the early years of the Pinochet government was not like the other military Bonapartist regimes the USA was backing. It was engaging in free market neoliberal wrecking. And after 4 or 5 years, the Pinochet government backed away from that, started renationalizing things because the chaos was just too extreme. But that was neoliberalism. That was the beginning of neoliberalism, where they were imposing radical free market policies. But Park Chung-hee, the dictator of South Korea, was not willing to go along with it. This is fascinating. This is important. There's nuance to everything. Was Park Chung-hee a bad dude? Absolutely. Was he a brutal anti-communist dictator? Absolutely. But he had come to power and become very popular with this state, military control over industries, Bonapartist authoritarian measures. So Park Chung-hee, who's become very popular because he raised living standards and he made the urban centers of South Korea very prosperous, wasn't too good to the folks in the countryside, definitely wasn't good to any socialists or labor organizers. But because he stabilized South Korea and raised living standards, he was popular, very popular in South Korea. Still today, he's very popular. His daughter was president recently. So Park Chung-hee is told by the United States, that they want to do neoliberalism and privatizations in South Korea. And he says, no, I'm not doing that. Hell no, I'm not doing that. I am not going to privatize this economy. That's how I got to be popular. Park Chung-hee is not going along with that. Meanwhile, Park Chung-hee is getting friendly to various governments that don't like the United States. Because why not? He's being independent. He's the leader of South Korea. It's his government. Park Chung-hee announced that having U.S. troops in South Korea was a bit of a problem, right? Because often there were instances where American troops, in South Korea would rape women. There'd be instances where American troops would run over, they just didn't care about the Korean people. They'd run over them with cars, and with tanks. They would drive over people's houses. And there were a lot of people in South Korea who hated the U.S. troops. So Park Chung-hee announced, he said, all right, I'll tell you what we're going to do in South Korea. We're going to get our own nuclear weapons. And then once we have nuclear weapons, at that point, North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons. If we have our own nukes, then we won't need these U.S. troops to be in South Korea. Park Chung-hee said he was going to get nuclear weapons for South Korea, and then they wouldn't need U.S. troops in South Korea. They wouldn't need the protection of the United States. The United States was trying to pressure him to do neoliberal free market reforms, and he realized that would ruin his popularity. And so, the people were continuing to riot against the American troops. There was widespread hatred for the presence of American troops among the South Korean population. They felt it was humiliating and degrading to have foreign troops on their soil. So Park Chung-hee is announcing, we're going to get nuclear weapons of our own, and then there won't be any need for American troops. And so what happened then? All of a sudden, and this is during the Carter administration, the late 70s, there was a huge congressional investigation of Korean businesses in the United States. A congressional committee was formed to investigate Korean business owners, Korean industrialists, Korean religious leaders. All of a sudden, Congress started going after all the South Korean business interests and political figures. And it became a big thing in American media that South Korea is a corrupt country and they've got these gangster businessmen that are actually criminals and they're doing business over here and they're lobbying politicians. It was a lot like Russiagate, what they did to Russia, this idea that Russia is interfering in American politics, blah, blah, blah. They did the same thing with South Korea. Jimmy Carter's administration went after the government of South Korea, and it was called Koreagate, and you can read about it. Nobody knows about this. This happened, right? Koreagate. And there was all kinds of congressional hearings and all kinds of demonization, even though the United States had basically put Park Chung-hee in power. The United States had arranged everything, but because they wouldn't go along with neoliberalism, because they were starting to become more independent, because they wanted to get their own nuclear weapons, so they didn't need U.S. troops in the country, the USA went after it. And then, very mysteriously, Park Chung-hee, the dictator of South Korea, you can look this up. It's fascinating. No one ever talks about this. The dictator of South Korea was in his own home having dinner with the head of the Korean CIA, the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. We don't know what happened. Supposedly they had an argument. And the head of the Korean CIA shot Park Chung-hee. The head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency murdered the president. Right here in the United States, we hear Lee Harvey Oswald, killed Kennedy, and we think, did he act alone? Maybe the CIA did it. No, the KCIA, the actual head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, shot and killed the Korean president. Park Chung-hee, could you imagine this? This would be like the head of the CIA killing the president of the United States at the White House. I mean, that's what happened, right? I mean, the head of their intelligence agency murdered their president in his own home. It was a crazy incident. Park Chung-hee was killed. And why was he killed? No one really knows why. No one really knows why the head of the KCIA killed the president, Park Chung-hee. Nobody knows why. But that just shows you that what the United States wants for South Korea is not, absolutely not. They don't want South Korea to be free. They're not protecting South Korea from North Korea. They're using South Korea. They're using it in a geopolitical chess game against Russia and China. And when South Korea started to assert its independence and started to say, you know what, we don't want to be used in your stupid chess game here. We want to have our own interests. Even the brutal, authoritarian, right-wing, anti-communist government of Park Chung-hee, even that government couldn't be tolerated, right? And that shows you a lot of, I mean, it's wild, right? So this is the history of the Korean Peninsula. This is the history of the Korean Peninsula. Recently, the government of South Korea set up the THAAD missile system, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense Missile System. And it was this huge, they purchased it from the United States. U.S. weapons manufacturers made a killing. They just made a killing, a huge amount of money. They made a huge amount of money off this THAAD missile system. Right? All kinds of South Korean taxpayer money was spent on buying this hugely expensive military weapons system from the United States. And in theory, it was supposed to protect South Korea from a North Korean attack. That's what it was supposed to be, the THAAD missile system. However, Russia and China both looked at that THAAD missile system and they said, no, you don't. No, you don't. The radars, they don't just go into North Korea. They go into China. They go into Russia. You can't do this. No, this is a threat. This is strike enabling. Right? This would enable missiles to be shot from South Korea that then would be able to deflect any retaliation. This is a strike enabling weapons system. No, Russia and China said, no, you cannot have the U.S. military come and set up the THAAD missile system, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System. Can't do it. Well, South Korea did it. And when they did it, China retaliated. And a lot of South Korean business owners lost a huge amount of money because China said, all right, you're going to set up this missile system that's threatening us. No, it's not just threatening North Korea. It's threatening us. It's threatening Russia. And the economy of South Korea really suffered because of the Terminal High Altitude Missile System, the THAAD missile system. And there's a lot of people in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, that are like, maybe I'm not a communist. Maybe I'm not a socialist. Maybe I don't like North Korea. We're tired of this bullshit. We're one people. We're one nation. Why can't we all just get along? Why don't we let the Korean Workers' Party run the North and do the communist thing? We can do the free market capitalist thing in the South, but we can all be one country. And why don't we just get these U.S. troops out of here? Why don't we get these soldiers from the United States? Why don't we tell them to pack up and leave? We're Koreans. We can handle it ourselves. That is overwhelming public opinion in South Korea right now. Millions and millions of people in South Korea right now are like, you know what? Yeah, okay, maybe we don't like North Korea. Yeah, okay, obviously, we're not, supporters of North Korea, but, does the USA really need to be over here? And, it would be better for South Korea if South Korean businesses could have joint ventures with North Korean businesses. There's a train system that has been set up to connect North and South Korea. And in fact, there was even a proposal, they talk about the Iron Silk Road, or the, what was it? The Trans-Eurasian, train system. I forget what it was called, but at one point in the 90s, there was talk of building a railway system that would go from the bottom of the Korean Peninsula into North Korea, into Russia, all the way over to Western Europe, to Poland. Could you imagine? And it would fit what's going on right now. Russia and China are trying to raise people out of poverty. And, you talk about what goes on in Vladivostok, at the Vladivostok Economic Forum. You look at the map. Look at the map, right? We talk about Western Europe. We talk about Russia. We talk about China. But there's this huge area. You look at Siberia, that vast area. You look at Mongolia. You look at Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, right? You look at the map. There's all these areas where there are people who live there. There are mountains full of minerals. There are deserts. There are forests. There's all kinds of areas that need development. And what Russia has done with the Eurasian Economic Union and what China has done with the One Belt, One Road initiative is try to bring these areas into the 21st century. When I was at the Valdy Discussion Club in Russia, I got to hear not just from the Russian President Putin, but from Jack Ma, the CEO, of Alibaba, and I also heard a speech by Aysel Toji, who is the head of the Norwegian Nobel Institute. That's the people who do the Nobel Prize. And Aysel Toji, in his remarks, he said that it's worth pointing out, we don't hear a lot about it in the United States, but in Eurasia, in this part of the world that we don't hear a lot about, in Central Asia, in Siberia, in Mongolia, this is like a golden era because Russia and China are raising whole areas out of poverty. Read about what's been done in Tibet, the poverty alleviation programs that the Chinese Communist Party has carried out in Tibet, where they built these amazing highways and power plants. They've taken people who lived in villages and huts and given them houses, just given them houses with running water and electricity, taking these rural Tibetans into the 21st century. It's amazing. It's amazing. Amazing what has been done. Amazing what has been done. And North Korea could join that. North Korea could join this emerging economic bloc of independently developing countries in Eurasia. And they probably will. It's only a matter of time before North Korea realizes, you know what? Russia's got our back. You know what? China's got our back. We're going to give up our nuclear weapons. And I am convinced that the reason that Donald Trump was excited about North Korea was because he realized that if the United States isn't in on those negotiations, if the United States isn't there when the deals are made, if they're, if it's only Russia and China who are in the room when the deal is made to get rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons, no American companies are going to get in on the action. And Jim Rogers, the legendary investor of Singapore, he was saying, you know what? I want my companies to get in there and make some of that money. And Donald Trump was saying, you know what? When North Korea opens up, I want there to be some Trump hotels there, right? Supposedly, Donald Trump's allies, they gave Kim Jong-un a flash drive with images of what North Korea could look like if it developed, right? With like images of what it could look like. And I think Donald Trump is right. It would be stupid for the United States not to join in and be part of the economic revival of North Korea. What could be wrong with that? Wouldn't it be great if young Americans that are, good at computers and stuff could, partner with South and North Korean, folks and develop new computer technology? That'd be great. Wouldn't it be great if American car manufacturers could team up with North Korea's state-run car manufacturers? Wouldn't that be awesome? But it wouldn't be good for Wall Street's global dominance. And here's what's really going on, folks. Here's what's really going on. The reason that John Bolton wrecked Trump's negotiations with North Korea, the reason that there was that attack, and thank you, T-Mac, for the super chat, the reason that there was that attack on the North Korean embassy is because of this. During the 1980s, all across Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union itself, they were having market reform and opening up. They would introduce market mechanisms. The Communist Party would loosen up the ideological restrictions, etc. And country after country, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Albania, Romania, they all had counter-revolutions, and the Communist Party was removed and free market neoliberalism was brought in and the countries fell apart. And in 1978, you'll remember that China also started having market reforms. And the United States assumed that in China, the market reforms would lead to eventually the Chinese Communist Party being overthrown. And in 1989, they tried their hardest. They tried their hardest to make the government of China fall with the Tiananmen thing, right? But it didn't happen. Didn't work. Chinese Communist Party is in power. And today, the Chinese Communist Party is stronger than it was at the time that Mao died. Right before the death of Mao, there was a horrendous anti-communist riot, 1976, the Tiananmen incident. It's a horrendous anti-communist riot in 1976. The Communist Party was on the verge of falling because the intellectuals, the students were tired of being suppressed, and the engineers and the scientists, they felt like the government was against them. But as a result of the market reforms, things in China got better for the middle class, better for the intellectuals, and now the Communist Party of China is much stronger. And in Vietnam, in the 1980s, late 80s, Vietnam started having market reforms, and the USA thought, okay, give it time, give it a couple years, they'll start having their market reforms. Thank you, Kinky. They'll start having their market reforms, and eventually the Communist Party of Vietnam will be overthrown. Didn't happen. In fact, today, the Communist Party of Vietnam is stronger than it was in the 80s because of the economic miracle that they've carried out, because of the achievements that they've carried out with their socialist-oriented market economy. So as a result of that, the neocons are saying, oh no, we can't do this for the Korean Workers' Party. If they have their reform and opening up, if they bring in foreign investment, if they raise more of their people out of poverty, if they have an economic boom, Kim Jong-un and the Korean Workers' Party is going to be more popular. And a revolutionary government is going to be more popular. We can't allow that. Meanwhile, unlike in China, where there is a big section of the party that is more or less, watering down Marxism. Xi Jinping is fighting against them, but there is a more reformist wing of the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping is moving China in a more revolutionary and communist direction, but there is a social democratic wing of the Chinese Communist Party. During the 1990s, Jiang Zemin said eventually China's goal was to adopt the Western system. That's been completely repudiated, but there's still a section of the Chinese Communist Party that feels that way. In addition to that, in Vietnam, there's a big section of the party that's similar, right? Again, the majority of the Vietnamese Communist Party believe in communism and Marxism and stuff, but there is a wing of the Vietnamese Communist Party that's like more or less, whatever, that says socialism just means a good economy for everybody and all of that. But in North Korea, there's no such thing. There is not a social democratic, reformist, moderate wing of the Korean Workers' Party. It doesn't exist. And how could it exist? How could it exist? The USA killed millions of their people in the Korean War. The USA killed millions of their people in the 90s, right? They've been subject to just straight up demonization and attacks. And I mean, it's vicious. Those movies like Team America, the South Park people, they made that horrendous movie. The way they spoke about North Korea in that movie was just utterly, utterly horrendous, and that there is, North Korea has been so demonized. How could they have a reformist wing that doesn't really believe in socialism? No, that Korean Workers' Party, the party that funded the Black Panthers and welcomed them to North Korea as heroes during the 1960s and 70s, that party that sent guns to the Palestinians, that party that sent guns to the Irish Republican Army, that party that gave funding to the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela, the Korean Workers' Party, they are a revolutionary communist Marxist party. If there ever was one. There's no reformist wing of the Korean Workers' Party. There's no revisionist wing. They are dedicated to the Juche ideology. They are dedicated to anti-imperialism and, defense of the Korean fatherland. They are dedicated to supporting. There's a lot of Africans, who fled their homeland. There's a lot of African people who live in North Korea. There's a lot of Palestinians who live in North Korea. So ridiculous. You read in American media, they make it sound like North Korea is a racial state. They have a long record of standing in solidarity with different colonized and oppressed peoples around the world. I mean, that is just a lie. You can read about. They recently built a monument about a decade ago. They built a monument in Senegal. North Korea built the Monument to Independence that is in the capital city of Senegal. It's a beautiful statue. North Korea built it for them. Robert Mugabe, for a long time, Robert Mugabe, his bodyguards were North Koreans. He hired North Koreans to be his bodyguards because those guys, they are going to protect your life. If you want to be protected, you get yourself some North Korean bodyguards. They got your back. No one can get through them. And, so there's a wing of the American deep state, the neocons, John Bolton and others, that were just determined, no, we will not let North Korea join the Eurasian economic miracle. We will not let North Korea join the One Belt, One Road initiative. We will not let North Korea enter the 21st century. They are going to remain barricaded. They're going to remain isolated. We will not do it. However, Mike Pompeo, he said, you know what? Fine. Let's negotiate with North Korea. And Donald Trump said, you know what? Fine. Let's negotiate with North Korea. And there are differences within the ruling class of the United States about it. And the difference really comes down to this difference I keep emphasizing. It is the neoconservatives, it is the Eastern establishment, the Council on Foreign Relations, the same people that are obsessed with Ukraine right now. Their goal is to ensure the dominance of Western banks and oil monopolies over the world economy. And those folks are adamant that North Korea must not be allowed to have an economic boom because it is a threat to unilateralism. It's a threat to the USA being at the center of the world economy forever. Meanwhile, it's those lower level capitalists, Jim Rogers, Donald Trump, Betsy DeVos, fracking companies, Elon Musk. They're like, hey, if American companies can make some money trading with North Korea, who cares? Right? The world, and they're more in touch with reality because at the end of the day, the world is not going to remain centered around America. Unipolarity is going to end. The world never remains centered around one area, right? The East and the West, there's going to be multipolarity. There's going to be multiple poles of influence and power in the world. Russia and China and, South Africa and South America. There's going to be different parts of the world, Africa, that are going to have influence. And the United States is going to have to just be part of a multipolar world economy. However, there are these forces, these neocons that are determined to not let that happen. They are determined to stay at the top of the world. And if that means unleashing chaos and instability across the world, if that means having endless wars, if that means driving down living standards, they're fine with it. But it's those lower level capitalists that like Tulsi Gabbard, that like Donald Trump, that like Carrie Lake, Elon Musk, that are just coming to terms with the inevitability of multipolarity. And it's those folks that want to move ahead with negotiating with North Korea. So I'm very optimistic right now. I'm very optimistic that if Republicans retake Congress, that'll be bad for Cuba. So I'm not advocating that because it'd be bad for Cuba. It'd be bad for Venezuela. They're in with those Miami right wingers. It'd be bad for Cuba. It'd be bad for Venezuela. It'd be bad for Iran. But if we see the Republican sweep that is predicted as a result of today's vote, if we see that, it's very likely that there could be hope for the Korean Peninsula. Very likely. And I'm optimistic about that. I fantasize in my mind about the day that President Tulsi Gabbard goes to North Korea and brings with her a delegation from the Center for Political Innovation. I'm fantasizing about that day. The day that the USA and North Korea established diplomatic relations, and our commander-in-chief, Tulsi Gabbard, flies there with a whole bunch of different American academics and scientists and medical officials and different people, and she brings with her 4 or 5 representatives of the Center for Political Innovation. Wouldn't that be amazing? I dream of the Center for Political Innovation becoming one of the main think tanks that goes around the United States explaining what's really going on the Korean Peninsula. No, it's not just evil dictators being evil. There's more to it than that. This is a misunderstood country that's under attack. I fantasize about the day that we have an exchange, and leaders of the Korean Workers' Party, who are experts on Marxism and socialism and historical and dialectical materialism, are touring American universities, giving lectures explaining Marxism and explaining the history of the Korean people and the White Robe movement and Kim Il-sung and his fight against Japanese imperialism, and touring American campuses, teaching real anti-imperialist, illiberal Marxism and the history of Korea. We have an exchange with the Koreans come here, and a group of 10 or 12 or 20 people from the Center for Political Innovation are touring North Korea, teaching them about the history of Abraham Lincoln and John Brown and Gus Hall and William Z. Foster and the civil rights movement in America and the Black Panthers. I am fantasizing about that day because the reality is, folks, we're transitioning toward a multipolar world. And that new economy that is emerging, centered around Russia and China, the Eurasian Economic Union, that new economy, that's the future. The Atlanticist economy centered around the West is dying. The Roman Empire, centered around Wall Street, is coming to a close. And that new economy that is centered around state control of the means of production, economic planning, abolishing the anarchy of production, raising people out of poverty, 5-year economic plans, that new economy is going to keep rising. And North Korea already has a decent relationship with Russia and China, and North Korea is going to be part of that economy. And folks, eventually the United States is going to have to be part of that economy. Rather than just fighting that economy and resisting it, you look through America, you look through the heartland of the United States, you look through Michigan, you look through Pennsylvania, you look through Alabama and Texas and so many devastated communities. The only way we're going to be able to get out of this mess is if we in the United States end up joining that economy as well. We need a government in Washington, D.C. that controls the banks and controls the natural resources and controls the industries and builds infrastructure and represents the people against the big bankers and elitists. We need what the North Koreans have. We need what the Chinese have. We need what the Venezuelans have. We need an anti-imperialist government in America. And where's that government going to come from? Well, it'll probably be a broad coalition of forces, but eventually we need there to be an anti-imperialist government in America. Because at the end of the day, this open international system, this global system of monopoly capitalism is bad for America. It's bad for American workers. It's bad for American families. This greed-based society that says there is no truth, this high-tech, low-wage economy, this postmodernism, this neoliberalism, this is not good for America. And eventually, I don't know how long it will take and how ugly the process will be, but eventually we will have an anti-imperialist government in America of some type. And my goal is to lay the foundation for spreading truth about how we can move toward an American brand of anti-imperialism, socialism, populism, community values. How can the United States be reborn on new principles of brotherhood and compassion and solidarity? How can we get a new America? You know, it's really easy to just go out there and say, burn it down, tear it down, burn it down, tear it down. Really easy to do that. All right. This is an evil country. It's founded on slavery and genocide. I hate America. Ah! Okay, we get it. That's so easy. It's cheap. But I'm challenging you to think, how do we get beyond that? How do we not just have a temper tantrum and let out our rage? How do we get beyond that? How do we build an America that isn't that? They're never going to convert to Kim Il-sung-ism in America. We're never going to have Mao Zedong thought running America. We're never going to have Che Guevara government running America. We're never going to have Bolivarianism in America. But I'll tell you what we do have in America. We've got John Brown. We've got Huey Newton. We've got William Z. Foster. We've got Gus Hall. We've got Susan B. Anthony. We've got Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. We've got all the people in American history who've stood against the wars, who stood for the rights of the workers, the rights of the women, the rights of the LGBT community, the rights of the impoverished people, the rights of the downtrodden. We have all the people in the history of this country who have stood for what is right and have stood against all the ugly things that have been dominant in the history of the United States. And all throughout U.S. history, we've always had that. Amid all the ugly things that went on, amid slavery, you had Nat Turner. You had the Underground Railroad. Amid the First World War, you had Eugene Debs. Amid the Vietnam War, you had thousands of young people who refused to go and went to prison rather than fight that ugly war, burned their draft cards. There is a good side to the American people. And the only hope for getting the United States out of the rut it's in is for that good side of the American people to reemerge. That's the only hope. You are not going to import some foreign ideology to America. You are not going to import some LARPy Marxism to America. You're not going to do it. The only hope we have for seeing an anti-imperialist America is to tap in to the anti-imperialism and the egalitarianism and the compassion and the solidarity and the brotherhood that has already been here, and to embolden it, and to give it a voice and to apply it. That is the only hope we have. So you can call it patriotic socialism. You can call it MAGA communism. You can call it socialism with American characteristics. You can call it whatever the hell you want to call it. But that's the only way it's going to happen.